and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View, and I'm so grateful that you have joined us. We're going to spend some time, as you might imagine, talking about this horrific incident in Boulder, Colorado, and then we'll move on to some other topics that are certainly relevant to your life. And in the next hour, we'll be talking about this book, The Immortal Mind, a neurosurgeon's case for the existence of the soul. You might say, well, we as Christians already believe that. Well, yes, but you go into any bookstore, I'll just use Barnes & Noble as a good example. The times I'll go in there and you'll see maybe Steven Pinker's book on the blank slate and others arguing that there is just a brain, not a mind, just a body, not a soul. And there are all sorts of neurophysiologists and others arguing that all we are is, if you will, one-dimensional. We know from the Bible, and we actually know from science, if we're really going to have an open mind, that indeed we have a soul. So I think you're going to enjoy that conversation. It's similar to a conversation we had just a couple of weeks ago with Lee Strobel. Dr. Michael Egner will be with us, and Denise O'Leary, probably best known for her book, The Spiritual Brain, will be with us, and we'll get into that. It will be a little bit scientific, but I think it will be life-affirming to you as well. Well, let's get to the incident of the day. Wasn't what originally going to be my first story, but it has to be now because of all the things that have transpired. You perhaps already know, but for some, you may have just heard for the very first time right now that we had a suspect in Boulder, Colorado, who was heard yelling "Free Palestine" during an attack. His rampage using a flamethrower and a Molotov cocktail set afire 8 people, 2 of whom have serious injuries, one including a Holocaust survivor who may not make it. And, of course, I don't know what's happened in the last hour because we've been busy getting ready for the program. So I hope that she hasn't passed on, but we just don't know. Nevertheless, this is an individual. Most likely from Egypt. I make a policy of not mentioning the name, but you could tell from the name that this is an individual who is here from a Muslim country. This is an individual who was here illegally on a tourist visa, overstayed the visa, which is a problem, which we've talked about before on this program, and then was able to get a work permit during the Biden administration. Stephen Miller, Deputy White House Chief of Staff, said a terror attack was committed in Boulder, Colorado by an illegal alien. He was granted a tourist visa by the Biden administration, and then he illegally overstayed that visa. In response, the Biden administration gave him a work permit. You have some people on the issue already and really focused on it. FBI Director Kash Patel, FBI Deputy Director Dan Bongino said on Sunday that they had sent personnel to the scene of the attack in Boulder. An investigation is underway. They referred to it as a terrorist attack. I'll get to that in just a minute because in some respects, the greatest outrage seemingly has not been over this anti-Semitic attack, because some people have called it a terror attack, is because it was called a terror attack. And it just is amazing to me that we can't seem to have any kind of perspective. But again, we have mentioned that one victim was in critical condition. According to Leo Tyrrell, who's the head of the Anti-Semitism Task Force for the Justice Department, he said this anti-Semitic terrorist attack is part of a horrific and escalating wave of violence targeting Jews and their supporters simply for being Jewish and for standing up for Jewish lives. And if you think about this, he goes on to suggest that if such violence is intended to deter the Jewish community, probably not. If anything, what we have found is that oftentimes it causes for Jewish individuals to be more resolute in their desire to speak out on this issue. One of the issues that you have to begin to think about is, isn't this connected? As a matter of fact, a very good piece, which I was thinking of posting by Noah Rothman, Where Are the Dot Connectors? And I'll talk about it philosophically and then practically over this time, because Noah Rothman says you never have to wait long before an act of right-wing political terrorism or even vandalism stirs a cottage industry devoted to connecting the dots. He says whether the connections are valid or spurious, sleuths emerge from the woodwork to eagerly draw crisscrossing threads across this particular individual's corkboard, if you will, linking the violence to figures they imagine might have benefited from this violence. This goes all the way back to the 1990s, when at that time President Bill Clinton suggested that the person that blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City was influenced by Rush Limbaugh. And there was evidence that he ever listened to Rush Limbaugh or was motivated at all. And that seems to be happening more and more as well. But, as Noah Rothman points out, this, if you're keeping count or keeping score at home, is the third act of some kind of terrorist violence in as many months. First of all, you have the attack on Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro's home by an anti-Israeli activist back in April. You have the gunning down of two young people outside an Israeli embassy event in Washington, D.C. in May. And then, of course, you have this one in Boulder, Colorado. And he says these are not isolated incidents. They are isolated because of the individuals probably don't know each other, but they all are part of a theme, which we would have heard about if the direction was the other way. He says, for example, it's not like this exercise would be difficult. It wouldn't take much enterprise to establish a thought line through the murderous violence targeting Jews and their supporters to the antisocial behavior that has been surfacing. And, of course, he gives lots of examples. Hamas flags, Hezbollah flags, headbands, of course, all the things happening on college campuses and the rest. And so one of the arguments is that the FBI, or at least the leaders in the FBI, have jumped on this too quickly. But as one commentator put it, some might object to the what he calls dehumanizing term for the perpetrator of Sunday's act of violence. But he says, what other word so accurately describes a man who shows up to a march of Americans marching to call on Hamas to release the remaining hostages and starts hurling Molotov cocktails to burn them to death? This is what has been taking place. And, of course, you can see that this, I think, shows, again, the concerns that we've had on this program for some time about anti-Semitism. Again, we recognize that it was just 2 months ago that a man attempted to burn down the governor's mansion in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. It was just a week and a half ago in which you had two individuals, Yaron Leshinsky and Sarah Lynn Milgram, actually gunned down in cold blood outside the young diplomat's reception of the American Jewish community in Washington, D.C. Let's give credit where credit is due. Governor Josh Shapiro says today America bore witness to yet another heinous act of anti-Semitism designed to terrorize a peaceful community. This type of hate-filled violence has no place in our civilized society and must be universally condemned. Appreciate his comments. I don't know how many other fellow Democrats will speak out. He deserves praise for addressing that because, after all, he was one of the individuals who was targeted by such violence. Let's take a break. As you imagine, we have a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
2 decades ago, Barbara Defoe Whitehead was on my radio program. At the time, she was one of the co-authors of a study done by the National Marriage Project at Rutgers University that came to this conclusion. Cohabitation is replacing marriage as the first living together experience for young men and women. What was true then is true today, but there's even more evidence of changing attitudes as well as additional social research on cohabitation. A survey by Pew Research asked American adults, when is it acceptable to live together? 2/3 said it was acceptable even if they don't plan to get married. Another 16% said it was acceptable only if they plan to get married, and only 14% said it was never acceptable. That may explain why living together has gone from rare to routine in the secular world, but also explains why so many Christian couples also see living together as acceptable. In the 1960s and 70s, only about 500,000 were living together. One study from a few years ago estimated that over 18 million Americans were cohabiting, and nearly a quarter of them are people over the age of 50 years old. Paul taught in 1 Thessalonians 4, it is God's will that you should be sanctified, that you should avoid sexual immorality, that each of you should learn to control his own body in a way that is holy and honorable, not in passionate lust like the heathen who do not know God. Living together outside of marriage not only violates biblical commands, but also so much of social research also documents that cohabitation before marriage puts a couple and their future marriage at risk. If you want to have a good marriage, don't do what the society says, do what the Bible teaches us to do. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on the biblical view on wokeness, go to viewpoints.info/wokeness. That's viewpoints.info/wokeness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We're going to move on in just a minute to some other topics, but Karen came in and said, well, we could post this article by Noah Rothman, so we'll see if we can post that a little bit later, and you can read it for yourself because he's asking a good question. You know, where are the people that are connecting the dots? There are times when sometimes we're connecting dots that make no sense, but this is the third example, and I think it is a very poignant and tragic example of the kind of violence that comes against Jewish people. Whether you want to call it a terrorist attack or not is really almost immaterial, because the bottom line is it's horrific and it has the same look as terroristic violence. So whether we want to define it that way or not is not the issue. For those who are critical of the idea of calling it terrorism, let's just go back and recognize that previous FBI directors, James Comey in particular, I'm thinking of, referred to terrorism not only when it was put together by a group, but also lone wolf terrorism. And so since this may be an individual that was acting on his own, that would still fit into the category of a lone wolf. But I'm not going to get into the battle about how you define the term. I just think there is always an attempt to sort of downplay anything that doesn't fit the narrative of the mainstream media. And of course, as you well know here at Point of View, we don't play along with that. By the way, lest you think the only people being attacked are Jewish people, there was a violent pro-Palestinian attack on the Democratic National Headquarters a while back. So it isn't like this is only showing up when Jewish people are present or when individuals who support Israel are present. You have other issues like this as well. And of course, just the insanity of it all, that even if you are convinced that what is going on in Israel is some sort of human rights abuse, what justifies that in going and essentially trying to burn to death people in Boulder, Colorado. It makes about as much sense as those people who didn't like the Department of Government Efficiency and said, well, the way I'll protest this is we will try to burn down some Tesla cars and thus affect the livelihoods of some of the people that work for Tesla and even affect the cars of some of the people that happen to be driving a Tesla car or truck. There's no rationality here at all. And I think it just shows, again, sort of the blind hate of Jewish people. And so one of the particular resources I would like to make available to you today is my recent booklet on anti-Semitism. Now, I'm well aware of the fact that 5 years ago we produced a booklet on anti-Semitism, but after October 2023, we noticed something very dramatic, and that was the fact that the justifications for all sorts of things, whether it's free Palestine or death to America, globalize the Intifada, Intifada revolution, all those phrases, a lot of those were pro-Hamas kinds of slogans, and they were being justified not so much from anti-Semitism, although they were, but justified from what we might call critical theory. So the booklet actually not only documents the sort of historical arguments against Jewish people, but some of the new phraseology there as well. And if you would like to get a copy of that booklet, a couple ways to do it. You can go to our website. There's a place where you can contact us, so just do so. And when you do so, if you want to just get a PDF of it, just let us know. We'll just need your email, and we'll send it off to you. Some of you probably are like me. You like to have the booklet in your hand, so in that case, you just need to give us an address. Glad to give it to you. Just one of the resources we want to put in your hands while we're talking about an issue that has become a perennial issue here on Point of View. I could probably spend all the hour on this, but there are other things that are of relevance, so let's get into that. My second article comes from Kenneth Kinchi again, and he is an individual that had worked at the back end of some of the things which involved the Nixon White House. Later was a speechwriter for Ronald Reagan, wrote a book which was very good, Behind Closed Doors in the Room with Reagan and Nixon. Nevertheless, he is saying that we now know, and not only from some of the latest reports and some of the latest books, but even some of, if you will, the confessions of individuals to say, we really knew that Joe Biden's mental decline was significant. We knew that he was not up to the task. And so Kenneth Kitchigan says, Kitchigian, I guess I should say, get the I in there, says missing from the hand wringing is a demand for accountability, which brings to mind the quip, everybody talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. And so he does point out that we do have right now the House Oversight Committee chairperson, that's James Comer, is showing and holding some hearings on the cover-up. But the argument he makes here is it's too narrowly aimed. What about the auto pen that in many cases was used to sign Joe Biden's signature when he did not even know anything about it? What about the unwillingness on the part of the Attorney General Merrick Garland to release the audio interview with Robert Hur, which now shows, if you've listened to it, and it's now available in some venues, how really compromised the president was. And so he then gives us this long list of individuals who should actually testify. This would look like a Watergate-style hearing. Jennifer O'Malley Dillon, Mike Donnellan, as well as some of the people like the White House counselor Steve Ricchetti, and of course the Chief of Staff Ron Klain, Bruce Reed, and just, the list goes on. It's quite a long list of individuals he thinks actually should be called to testify. And if you've listened to Point of View, we did a while back share, but it's worth mentioning again, the story that came to us from the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. Mike Johnson went to meet with with President Biden after a long time of being pushed off and not even given access to the president. And they kept saying, no, we need to talk. There's some very important issues we have to address here in terms of national security. Finally, after pushing and threatening everything, he was able to get a meeting with the president. And then in the midst of the meeting, all of a sudden, he said, well, I do need to talk to you about a couple of important things, Mr. President. And you saw President Biden say, okay, everybody in the room, I need you to clear the room so we can talk with Speaker Mike Johnson. And the look on everybody's face was enough to tell you he's not going to be able to handle this. But they left. And so then he began to explain his concern about the fact that he had paused all these permits to export American liquefied natural gas, which was coming from, of course, his home district there in Louisiana and would actually help the European allies in their war against Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. And the reaction from Joe Biden, President Biden, was, no, I didn't do that. And they went through and explained more of it. And he was told that all he was simply doing was providing further development of liquefied natural gas. And so he was very obviously lied to about that. No evidence as to whether or not he even signed the document anyway, because it was probably signed by an auto pen. So this is why Kenneth Kichijian is actually saying who signed off on the Afghanistan pullout, resulting in the deaths of 13 American service members. What role did the Secretary of State Antony Blinken or National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan play in foreign policy decisions without explicit presidential authority, especially during and after Hamas's assault on Israel on October 2023? And, of course, then what if Xi Jinping had moved into Taiwan during that time? Who would be controlling foreign policy, military policy, and the rest? And so it seems to him that what needs to happen is that Mike Johnson, who is the Speaker of the House, and John Thune, Senator John Thune, who's the Senate Majority Leader, should open an inquiry with more staff, investigators, and lawyers who have broad subpoena powers, because they are individuals that indeed need to trace down all of the sources. And if you're familiar at all with this new book by Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson, which is called Original Sin, those particular journalists said that they talked to 200 different sources connected to the effort to hide President Biden's diminished cognition, his diminished mental acuity. And so we're talking about something that needs to be a set of hearings that maybe look a little bit like Watergate. And for those who say, well, that may be overkill, can you think of another scandal worse than the fact that major decisions were being made every day supposedly by someone around the president, and he, in many cases, did not know what they were? I think that's a pretty good scandal, and that's why we need an investigation. It's our second article that you can read on the website. We'll be right back.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer. And that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kirby Anderson.
Back once again. Certainly, we've already talked about where are the dot connectors, talking about this issue of anti-Semitism. Karen put that up. It's our first article. The second one, should we have Watergate-style hearings for the Biden cover-up? I'd love to get your thoughts before we get on to some of the other articles we've posted. And I might just say that sometimes the best way to figure out how to deal with some of those issues is to turn it around. So let's just imagine that maybe in the first term of Donald Trump that all of a sudden we didn't see him for a while. Now, again, I recognize you're going to have to stretch your imagination a little bit. The tendency is for Donald Trump to be so much on the go that he wears out his aides and assistants. But nevertheless, let's just assume that all of a sudden he kind of just disappears and you start wondering who's running the government. And then we find out after the fact that there were people behind the scenes signing things for him, making decisions for him, limiting his access to the public, to the cabinet, and everything else. Do you think there'd be a call for Watergate-style investigations? I think so. I think for those of you that have been around when Watergate took place, what did you know and when did you know it? When did you first perceive the president was not up to the task? What did you do to hide that from the public? Were you complicit in actually signing executive orders or even legislation that he was unaware of? You know that if it was turned around the other way, this would be front page headlines. Instead, everybody's saying, well, yawn, let's move on. We'll just recognize that we dodged a bullet. But I think, as we point out, there is some accountability. So what's your thoughts? Love to get your thoughts. That number is 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. And it also gets us into our third article, and that is what's going on with the media. This one is entitled by Beckett Adams, What on Earth is Wrong with 60 Minutes? Now, Beckett Adams kind of puts in the crosshairs a man by the name of Scott Pelley, who, by the way, is one of the anchors at, of course, CBS Evening News. He's a managing editor. Of course, he's been with 60 Minutes. I've known of him since he used to work here in the Dallas market, WFAA, so I've followed his career for some time. There's some things I've liked about him, but this sort of pious, self-satisfied kind of statement that he's making now is causing some people to say, wait a minute, where is this coming from? Beckett Adams says, look, CBS News' Scott Pelley launched into a self-satisfied tirade, recently sermonizing on the greatness of his profession and the wickedness of his critics. Yet in playing the pious minister, the network correspondent achieved the opposite of his intended goal. Rather than advocate on behalf of his colleagues and the industry as he currently operates, he merely reminded everyone why the public loathes journalists and their employers. After all, it's hard to sympathize with an industry whose members hold such high opinions of themselves despite their evident flaws, chronic shortcomings, and occasional ethical failures. I won't go into all the issues, but here Beckett Adams reminds us that at one point in time, not so long ago, really the gold standard for investigative journalism was 60 Minutes. I'll acknowledge that. It's now a shadow of its former self. He goes through kind of a really and when it was helpful list, because I'd forgotten a lot of these things, of how many times they were violating, I think, just standard journalistic practices. 1986, 60 Minutes aired footage purporting to show unintended acceleration in a new Audi 5000. Turns out that this was from a rig test, and CBS never apologized. Mid-1990s, you have the Brown and Williamson affair. That's where 60 Minutes delayed and even buried interview with Jeffrey Wigand, the tobacco industry whistleblower. By the way, you may have seen the movie. I've seen the movie about that, in which, again, just unbelievable the way they covered that. 1999, 60 Minutes aired a segment alleging that the San Diego Customs Service Office was intentionally ignoring drug smuggling. This story relied on secret memos. Oh, have we heard this before with CBS? Turns out it was actually forged by a disgruntled former employer. Network did apologize for that one. 2004 60 Minutes presented forged memos alleging that George W. Bush had gone absent without leave during his service in the National Guard. Those of you a little bit older might remember all of that. These were forgeries and a variety of other things. And then in 2009, 60 Minutes ran a segment on cyber crimes featuring a photo of a supposed fearsome team of Russian hackers. Later on, they showed one of them was a 14-year-old. That was not good enough. Turned out that was a picture of Finnish school children, which even the people in the Finnish media were just rolling their eyes at. 2012, of course, CBS correspondent Bob Simon claimed that a security fence erected by Israel to protect its citizens from attacks from West Bank actually completely surrounds Bethlehem and thus created an open-air prison. Well, I've taken you to Bethlehem before on some of our trips from Point of View. You know the fence was located on the north and west part. The rest of the city has no barriers at all. That was something you could check out with a Google map, if nothing else. 2021, you had, of course, the accusation of Governor Ron DeSantis of a pay-to-play vaccine rollout scheme, supposedly with Publix supermarket. Of course, there's no truth to that one either. You have some other ones that I thought were just kind of crazy. But when you get to the Trump ones, those are the most interesting because you might remember the infamous, and I do say infamous, interview that Donald Trump did with Leslie Stahl in first, where he was talking about the fact that the administration, the Obama administration, spied on his campaign. She said that can't be verified. Of course, it's totally verified. And it turns out that that was a fact well known and well documented long before the interview with Donald Trump. But Leslie Stahl sat there and just deflected and dismissed everything he said about that. In that interview, then also there was the comment about whether or not this laptop belonged to Hunter Biden. You remember that one? And again, he said it's very important to find out whether or not a man is corrupt who's running for president, who's accepted money from China, from Ukraine, from Russia. By the way, we knew all that a long time ago. But nevertheless, she says all that has been investigated and discredited. It had not, of course. And then she said it can't be verified. Of course it can be verified and go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And before it's all through, what you end up with, as Beckett Adams says, is that Scott Pelley and the people at CBS and 60 Minutes proclaim that journalism and truth itself is under attack. And he ends by this: yes, but from whom? Sometimes it illustrates once again, don't have to trust everything I say, don't have to trust everything we even report on. We give you the articles. You can follow the articles. You can see what we post. You can check it out. And if we've made a mistake, I am quite willing to apologize. But sometimes I tend to wait a while so that we really know indeed whether or not some of the things that have been posted are indeed one of those concerns. So let's see if we can take some phone calls. We'll go first to JB in Oakland, California. JB, what would you want to say?
All right. I'm so glad I found this radio station with you. I haven't heard you before. I've listened to talk around for it. But I've been a lifelong Democrat, and bad God,
I guess we're having a little trouble hearing him. He is saying he's a lifelong Democrat, but I think we've got just too much distortion there to keep the phone call going. But anyway, he says he's concerned about journalism, and we'll take another phone call. That one just didn't turn out very well. Just a little bit hard to listen to. But let me just mention that once again, as we're going to a break, we'll get into some other topics. This one here might be helpful for those of you that say, well, are we really to a point where we should be questioning journalism? And I come back to the piece by Beckett Adams, because there was a time in which 60 Minutes, and let's put another one in that pantheon, I mean, maybe Ted Koppel's Nightline, really sort of were the gold standard in the case of 60 Minutes for investigative journalism. For Nightline, maybe the gold standard for allowing a point-counterpoint interview. Oh, there's some others, of course, there, Crosstalk and a variety of others that came out there as well. But it's just an illustration that that's not what we find today. And it is, I think, striking that the more some of these journalists, or in some cases, we talked about just a minute ago in terms of whether or not to have hearings on the Biden cover-up, some of the individuals, even in the previous White House, the more challenged they are, the less you get someone saying, well, we made a mistake, or, we didn't know that at the time. But instead, there's almost a desire to pound the fist on the table even more, rather than admit that, okay, just the fact is we cover stories every day. We're not going to bat 1,000, and sometimes we make a mistake. Okay, I'll appreciate that humility. That's not exactly what we receive from people like Scott Pelley, and that's why Beckett Adams wrote the piece. But you can read it for yourself, because I've given you just a very scant summary of about 5 pages of really documented material. Let's take a break. We'll see if we can get another phone call up. All that coming up right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, 1-800-351-1212. See if we can try the phones again. I'm hoping that was just a one-off. Although I was listening to a talk show earlier today, and they were having trouble with their 800 lines. Well, let's head out to California, KNLB. Kathy, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, I had heard somewhere on one of the many conservative-type shows that they have on YouTube, and I don't go by the gospel of YouTube, so but somebody had mentioned that, this was on the side of treason, the liquefied natural gas, with China and Russia racing to get as many of the natural resources. But not only that, you had Spain who said, well, we don't need regular energy like nuclear and all that. We're going windmill, and they were just knocked out. And then you've got, then you had something, it was Myanmar who went all green.
Yes.
And I mean, this is like our national security. And now Trump is trying to get what they have, the Golden Dome or whatever it is to go. And so what's next? We're going to turn off all our satellites?
Well, let me try to respond to that. I think treason would be a bridge too far. I think, first of all, trying to prove that would be difficult, although if you were using the auto pen or something like that to transfer information about nuclear codes or military capability or something like that, that could be. But I think you've got enough to simply charge individuals with forgery and conspiracy at the highest levels. Forgery and conspiracy at the highest level, I think you get locked away and they throw away the key, and that would be enough. And the fact that there is sort of this collective yawn right now from the media, when you know if the role was reversed and this had happened under, say, the Bush administration or the Trump administration first time or something like that, this would be front page headlines. There would be a drumbeat every single day to have accountability. And the fact that we have people publishing books and coming out with various statements, in a sense, trying to cover themselves, I think, as much as anything, that I think needs to change, which is why I posted that particular article as our second article. And if you'd like to read it, here is my recommendation. I always like to give you an assignment. You might want to print it out. And you might, next time you have a member of Congress, maybe having a town hall meeting, hold it up or hand it to him or her and say, don't you think we should have an investigation, and more than just, what happened, but call for accountability. And when they say, well, I think what we have right now in the Oversight Committee is enough, to say, if the role was reversed, do you think if Democrats were in control of Congress that they would simply have an open investigation, or do you think they would want to put people in jail for this? And do you think that national security might have been affected? And you don't even have to go and use the T word, treason. I think you can get people's attention very quickly in that regard. And I do know that oftentimes when members of Congress don't see the light, they feel the heat. If all of a sudden there was an outcry from some of the listeners here on Point of View alone at a few of these town hall meetings to say, we need to know what happened so this does not happen again. We need to know who was running the government illegally. This is a real constitutional crisis, not the phony one that has been brought up in the past. So I think you've got a couple of things that would work in your favor. Just before we run out of time, let me mention I've also posted a very good piece by Victor Davis Hanson in which he reminds us that there have been some ideas being promoted by the Democratic Party, and as a result, there are some within the party right now that are trying to, if they can, pull individuals back from the precipice, and that's not working very well. So to use Victor Davis Hanson's arguments, Democrats made themselves toxic. Now they're addicted to their own poison. And so he goes through quite a bit. Of course, one of those is how Americans were lied to about the cognitive decline and even the cancerous condition of President Joe Biden. Again, if you think that they just now discovered prostate cancer, well, we have some swampland we'd love to sell you, because that is certainly something. Then they go into some of the other issues that are related to that, even pick up on the ways in which there have been attacks to, of course, Donald Trump and anybody associated with him. And so it's a really good piece because right now, as Jeffrey Blahar in his piece, which we published a while back, Democrats are in disarray. That's a phrase that's been used for some time, but it's even being used by people in the Democratic Party as well. And they are trying to figure out where they go. His argument is, and this is an argument being used by some of the leaders in the Democratic Party, that the Democratic Party is being pulled apart by horses. On the one hand, the party is increasingly held in contempt by their most reliable voter demographics. That would be Hispanics, African Americans, working class men, because they're seen oftentimes as out-of-touch elitists, maybe even taking orders from various institutions, part of the Ivy League, and even people on the progressive ultra-left. On the other hand, as Jeffrey Blahar points out, just as relevant, the party is crippled from within by the same kind of faction, which is held, if you will, kind of what you might call an ideological whip hand over the social agenda of Democrats for some time. And so there's been an attempt for some people to speak out. There's also been what has been called the abundance agenda. I've been tempted to write about this book that came out about the abundance agenda, which is trying to point out that, we Democrats, because this is written by leftists, do believe in government, but we have to also admit that government sometimes is the biggest problem to achieving its functions because it's too big, it's too bulky, it's too bureaucratic. The reality, though, is that it hasn't really been well received by the party faithful and by the people that are in the elites. And so the Democratic Party, of course, is facing, if you will, some of the political and ideological issues, but it's facing one more before we take a break, and that is the 2030 census, still many years away. But the 2030 census means that you're going to have even fewer House seats and thus electoral votes from California and New York. And you're going to have even more House seats and electoral votes in states like Florida and Texas. So if you're trying to be optimistic in the Democratic Party right now, you've got a little bit of an uphill climb, to put it mildly. I think we always benefit when we have a two-party system because not all perfection is in one party, not all errors are in the other party. But right now, the Democratic Party seems to be wanting to focus more and more on those 20% issues, and the Republican Party, especially Donald Trump, wants to focus on the 80% issues. And it does not look so good for even the midterm elections, but long time between now and the next election a year from this November. But nevertheless, I just wanted you to see some of these pieces. This very good piece by Victor Davis Hanson, the previous one by Jeffrey Blahar, are just a reminder that we're in the midst of some major social and political transformation. And as you might imagine, we'll be covering it every single day here on Point of View. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to read some of these articles for myself, simply go to the website, pointofview.net, click on that button that says See More, and you will find lots of articles, including ones we'll talk about next hour as we talk about the immortal mind on the whole argument for the existence of a soul. We'll be right back.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
My husband and I are your supporters. We just really appreciate the show and the people you bring on.
I just want to commend you guys on your program. I love listening to you.
It's a blessing. Been listening to you for several years. Your program has helped my family see current events and elections and politics through the eyes and the principles of Scripture. And that's been enlightening, and we're trying to pass that on to others.
I want to say, first of all, that I really enjoyed the Millennial Roundtable, and I love the program altogether. I think Kirby is great, and I really appreciate all of y'all, all that y'all do, and the truth that y'all put out.
Hey, great show. Love all your comments and what you're talking about.
Thanks again for what you do.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
You know, here on Point of View, we like to address some of these issues that are under attack and help you from an apologetics point of view know how to defend those. And certainly one of those that I discovered years ago, if you go into bookstores, is the argument coming from a lot of neurophysiologists and others that really all we have is a brain. There's really no mind. What you call a mind is just an artifact of the brain. We have a body, but there's no soul. And I began to write about that on mind, brain, and neuroethics and some things like that. It's something we've covered from time to time, and it does seem to me that there is a real need to provide answers to some of those challenges. And even as recently as the last couple of months, of course, we had J.P. Moreland on to talk about his book, Dualism and the Soul. And, of course, just about a week or two ago, we had Lee Strobel on, Seeing the Supernatural, which gets into some of that as well. But this new book, I think, would be the most helpful, especially if you're in this science area. And even though we're going to be talking about science, I think you're going to find it easy to follow. The book is entitled The Immortal Mind, A Neurosurgeon's Case for the Existence of the Soul. Dr. Michael Egnor, we have information about him and the book. Also, his particular speech that he gave at the 2025 Dallas Conference on Science and Faith on Is the Soul Real? And the co-author is Denise O'Leary, individual we've quoted many times before because of her book, The Spiritual Brain. Let me go and try to introduce both of those. First of all, Dr. Egnor is not only a professor of neurosurgery and pediatrics at the Renaissance School of Medicine at Stony Brook University, also has his medical degree from Columbia University, but most importantly, as I just mentioned a minute ago, a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute Center for Natural and Artificial Intelligence. And in addition to having information about his book on the website, we also have some information about the speech that he gave recently, just down the road from where we're broadcasting here today at the Dallas Conference on Science and Faith. So, Dr. Egnor, thank you so very much for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me.
And I've already kind of introduced Denise O'Leary, individual we talk about and certainly have benefited from her book, The Spiritual Brain, A Neuroscientist's Case for the Existence of Soul. And Denise, welcome back to Point of View.
I really exist. I'm not an avatar.
Well, let's, if we can, Dr. Egnor, get your story first. As I said before we were able to connect up with you, we've been talking about some of this with J.P. Moreland's book, The Dualism and the Soul, even Lee Strobel's latest book, Seeing the Supernatural. But you kind of begin with, if you will, not only a scientific pilgrimage of starting to believe in the soul, but a spiritual pilgrimage from atheist to Christian. Can you share that with us?
Certainly. I was born and raised in a household that didn't really have religion. My mother took me to church on rare occasions when I was a kid, but I wasn't baptized. And I fell in love with science as a young child, and I desperately wanted to be a scientist, and then ultimately wanted to be a doctor. I majored in biochemistry in college. I went to medical school, and I fell in love with neuroscience. I fell in love with the anatomy of the brain and the physiology of the brain. And I thought that would really help me understand what it meant to be human, to understand how the mind worked. And I remained an atheist. I never had any hostility to Christians. I wasn't an angry atheist. I thought Christianity was a nice thing and Christians were nice people. I just thought it was a myth. I didn't think it was scientific. And a couple of things happened to me in my personal life. I began having these episodes where I used to call them hauntings, where I would just start thinking about, like, why am I here? What's the purpose for my life? Where did I come from? Sort of obvious questions. And I really wanted an answer to it. I didn't think that Christianity could offer the answer, but I knew that there should be an answer to it. Then I have 4 kids. When my youngest child was born, we were concerned that he was autistic when he was a baby. He didn't make eye contact. He didn't smile. And so we took him to a doctor. They said they really couldn't be sure. We'd have to wait and see. And this was agony for me, because I was concerned that if he was severely autistic, he might not even know me, might not even love me. And that was a very painful thing. So one night I was seeing a patient in a Catholic hospital. And when I got done seeing the patient, I was really upset emotionally. And there was a chapel there. So I went in the chapel and I got down in front of the altar and I prayed. And I said, God, I don't know if you really exist, but in fact, I don't think you do exist, but you're my last hope here. Please don't let my son be autistic. I can't take the idea that he wouldn't know me, that he wouldn't love me. And I heard a voice, only time in my life I've ever heard a voice, and the voice said, "But that's what you're doing to me." And I collapsed. I said, "All right, Lord, I won't do it to you anymore." Next morning, I called the church and said, "How can I get baptized as soon as possible?" And my family, and we worked things out. And I went. A couple days later was my son's 6-month birthday, and went home to the little party, and he was perfectly normal. He was smiling and making eye contact, the normal baby.
Yeah.
So I went through a kind of Damascus Road experience, but I also saw in my care of patients, when I would take care of people who had serious brain problems, that many of the patients I had, their minds didn't connect to their brain well. That is that, for example, I had a little girl who was born missing half or 2/3 of her brain. And I told her family that she probably wouldn't do very well, that she was going to have a lot of trouble. And she's grown up completely normal, perfectly fine, missing major parts of her brain. And I've seen that with quite a few patients. I've done awake brain surgery where we operate on people when they're awake. We use local anesthesia so they don't feel pain. And we do it to map the surface of the brain so we can identify critical areas so that we don't damage them when we're taking out tumors, for example, treating seizures. And one patient was a lady who had a brain tumor that was infiltrating much of her left frontal lobe. And I was taking out the tumor, including a substantial part of the left frontal lobe of her brain, while I was talking to her. And she was under the surgical drapes, and we had a nice conversation for several hours as I was removing parts of her brain. And that wasn't in any of my textbooks. When you go back to the neuroanatomy and neurophysiology textbooks, there's no way you could remove parts of a person's brain without affecting them. So I really came to feel that what I was learning in science wasn't the truth about the nature of the mind, the nature of the brain, and the nature of the human soul. So I started reading Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and a lot of Christian theology and Christian psychology, and came to understand the relationship between the soul and the body in a very different way.
Very good. Let's take a break because we need to have one of those breaks. But again, as I mentioned, we've talked about this idea of dualism and all of that. So we'll get back into this in just a minute. And when we come back, I'd also want to talk with Denise O'Leary about something I remember we talked about a long time ago with some of the research of Wilder Penfield, which gets into mapping the brain of an awake patient. And what about these conjoined twins? There's some great arguments that we're going to talk about. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
2 decades ago, Barbara Dayfo Whitehead was on my radio program. At the time, she was one of the co-authors of a study done by the National Marriage Project at Rutgers University that came to this conclusion. Cohabitation is replacing marriage as the first living together experience for young men and women. What was true then is true today, but there's even more evidence of changing attitudes as well as additional social research on cohabitation. A survey by Pew Research asked American adults, when is it acceptable to live together? 2/3 said it was acceptable even if they don't plan to get married. Another 16% said it was acceptable only if they plan to get married, and only 14% said it was never acceptable. That may explain why living together has gone from rare to routine in the secular world, but also explains why so many Christian couples also see living together as acceptable. In the 1960s and 70s, only about 500,000 were living together. One study from a few years ago estimated that over 18 million Americans were cohabiting, and nearly a quarter of them are people over the age of 50 years old. Paul taught in 1 Thessalonians 4, it is God's will that you should be sanctified, that you should avoid sexual immorality, that each of you should learn to control his own body in a way that is holy and honorable, not in passionate lust like the heathen who do not know God. Living together outside of marriage not only violates biblical commands, but also so much of social research also documents that cohabitation before marriage puts a couple and their future marriage at risk. If you want to have a good marriage, don't do what the society says, do what the Bible teaches us to do. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on the biblical view on wokeness, go to viewpoints.info/wokeness. That's viewpoints.info/wokeness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, the book is entitled The Immortal Mind, just now coming out. Probably have a little difficulty finding it in your local bookstore, but we have a link so that you can get it in hardback or Kindle, and there are all sorts of resources that we've posted there, including the speech that was given by Dr. Michael Egnor when he was speaking at the Dallas Conference on Science and Faith, which is all part of the Discovery Institute, and we'll get into some of that in just a minute. Denise O'Leary, let me come to you because, of course, you've written The Spiritual Brain, but one of the things I mentioned just a minute ago was Wilder Penfield. I remember when we first published a book years ago around here by Arthur Custance, The Mysterious Matter of Mind. That goes back 45 years. But at that time, Wilder Penfield had just died. But the fact is that you can, with the brain open, as Dr. Egnor was pointing out, touch certain parts of the brain. And I remember one story where they moved the hand, and he said, well, why'd you move the hand? He said, I didn't. You made me move it. And it's like you have, the brain is a computer, but there's somebody watching the computer, and that's argument really for a spiritual brain, isn't there?
Well, that's what Penfield came to think. Now, Mike knows way more about all that than I do because he actually does brain surgery. But Penfield wrestled most of his life, I think, with the question. And finally, toward the end, he wrote a book, The Mystery of the Mind, which I believe was published the year before his death, 1975,
right,
in which he essentially said, in a kind of a non-dramatic way, that the mind was not simply the brain. Now, that did not receive much publicity because the other way is the way you're supposed to think, as poor old Christoph Koch found out the hard way. But yes, he was for one of the linchpins of the Montreal Neurological Institute.
You know, Dr. Enger, you were talking about the fact that sometimes you can have half a brain. I remember the old joke by Dr. Ben Carson. I've actually worked with people that have half a brain, and that was before I went to Congress and dealt with them. But nevertheless, the point is that there are sometimes people can lose half their brain and they're still functioning. And that's why you have a section early on that the brain can be split, but not the mind. Or another example that you use is when a person maybe is unconscious and then regains consciousness after being unresponsive, they actually have a mind again. And that really seems to be a very strong argument against the idea that the mind is just an outgrowth of the brain. It seems to be a pretty powerful argument for there being a mind and a soul. Can you explain?
Yes. The split brain research is absolutely fascinating. There's an operation that was developed back in the 1940s in which the hemispheres of the brain were split apart.
Mm-hmm.
And the split is almost complete. There's virtually very, very little connection left between the two hemispheres. And this was to prevent the spread of seizures. And patients did much, much better with their seizures when the brain was split. Surprisingly, when patients have this operation done, and I've done the operation, they're perfectly normal afterwards. That is, that it would be almost as if you took a chainsaw and cut your computer in half and found that it really worked just fine. There was no problem with it even being cut in half. So that was a very strange thing. There was a researcher named Roger Sperry who studied these patients very, very carefully and developed techniques of showing pictures to the individual hemispheres separately. And he did find that there were some minor perceptual disabilities that these people had after their brains were split that correlated with the splitting. But for all intents and purposes, these people were perfectly normal. And what that implies is that there is a soul that these people have that is not split with a knife. That is, that your soul is not the same thing as your brain.
Right.
And there's even recent research that absolutely fascinates me, where people can compare images. People who've had split brain surgery, you show one picture to one hemisphere, another picture to the other hemisphere, and then you ask them to compare them, and they can compare them quite accurately. The interesting thing is that no part of their brain has seen both pictures. So what is it that's doing the comparing?
Fascinating.
It's the soul.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating research.
One of the things I wanted to come to you, Denise, is what is called paradoxical lucidity. That's a big, long word, but it has to do with the fact that you had an aged father diagnosed with dementia. I can relate to that because that's exactly what I had to deal with my father as well. Did not really notice his surroundings, but then in the midst of that showed a shocking amount of lucidity. First of all, tell the story, because I think that is another, powerful argument for a mind and a brain as well, a mind that's separate from the brain. Can you explain?
Well, my father was in his late 90s, and he was living in a care home across the street from me, and I visited him every day. As you say, he had dementia and was, not aware the way he would have been when he was young of what was going on. But one day he quite shocked me. My back was to him, and he said in a very clear way. People who have dementia often don't speak clearly, but in this case he did. He said, "Denise, when I'm gone, you won't have to work so hard anymore."
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, what? It was true, but to actually hold that idea in his mind, he had to suddenly, at that point, be aware of a number of different things. Who I was, that he had an estate, that I was one of his heirs, that on his death I would inherit money, and could actually have a bit of an easier life. But you see, that wasn't the only time he showed paradoxical lucidity, and it was just the one that's easiest to explain, because you don't need to know anything about our family to know that. Mm-hmm. I looked it up, and apparently this is studied by neuroscientists. Nobody knows how it is that people with dementia can suddenly become lucid for a short period.
Yes.
They say it happens shortly before death. But in my dad's case, it was 2 years before his death, approximately. And and of course, what I don't know is, because people who have dementia don't tend to be visited nearly as often as others, is it true that it mostly happens just before death, or is it more the case that people gather when they know that someone is dying, and so they're more likely to hear it? I simply don't know. And by the way, I'm not the only person to raise that question, because in one study, the researchers raised it.
Right.
So,
and in one of the studies, 124 people with dementia, more than 80% experienced this lucidity, a complete remission with return of memory, orientation, everything. Dr. Egner, that just, again, I think is a powerful argument for the fact that there's something beyond the brain that is working to all of a sudden recognize your surroundings, your circumstances, and everything, and provide at least a momentary time of lucidity. And anybody that's been around a deathbed has seen that before.
Yes, it's relatively common that people have those experiences. Another fascinating experience that is related to that is research done by Adrian Owen, who's a scientist who was working in Cambridge, England, back about 20 years ago. Took patients who had what's called persistent vegetative state, and that's basically the deepest level of coma. And he put them in MRI machines, and he did something called functional MRI imaging, where he could look at patterns of activation of the brain. But these patients had almost completely destroyed brains. There's a little bit of brain tissue there, but not much. And he would ask them questions in the machine, and their brains would light up on the MRI scan, indicating that they were able to understand what he was asking. And he got to a point, and this has been replicated by many researchers, where he could converse with people in the deepest level of coma. So their minds are functioning remarkably well, given that their brains are almost completely destroyed, which is what you would expect if the soul has an independent existence from the brain.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we've only covered some of this sections here. What about when two minds must share body parts? That's the issue of conjoined twins. What about near-death experiences? I wrote a book back in 1980 on the whole issue of out-of-body experiences and near-death encounters, but we know so much more now than back then, and some of the other arguments for the soul. It's all part of this book, The Immortal Soul. It is written by Michael Egner as well as Denise O'Leary, a neurosurgeon's case for the existence of the soul, about 250 pages, great material, and I think it would be very encouraging to you. A perfect book to hand to maybe a skeptic who is convinced that all we are is body and not soul, all we are is brain and not mind. This, I think, would challenge them at their very core level and really open up some conversation. We'll have that conversation right after these important messages.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Continue conversation today as we talk about the book The Immortal Mind, 250 pages, 13 chapters, written by Michael Egnor as well as Denise O'Leary, A Neurosurgeon's Case for the Existence of the Soul. If you'd like to know more about either of these particular authors, we have links on our website. We have information about this book, as well as a video that you might want to watch of the presentation that Dr. Egnor did on Is the Soul Real?, which occurred at the 2025 Dallas Conference on Science and Faith, which is all part of the Discovery Institute. Dr. Egnor, let's, if we can, get into an argument that I'd never even thought about, and that is what happens when you have two minds that must share body parts, because we have this situation of conjoined twins, but in the case of these two girls in British Columbia, they are joined at the head. A separation essentially is impossible, but it gives us an insight in the difference between the brain and the mind, doesn't it?
Yes, it's absolutely fascinating. Their names are Krista and Tatiana Hogan, and they live in British Columbia, and they're now young ladies, and they were born joined at the brain, actually, and they have something called a thalamic bridge, which is a part of the brain that connects their two brains. So they share many sensory and motor functions. For example, they can see out of each other's eyes. They can feel each other's skin. They share control of several of each other's limbs. But what they don't share is their personalities. They're rather different people. They have two completely different centers of consciousness. They have debates and fights. They don't agree on things. And what it suggests is that there are parts of the mind and of the soul that are intimately linked to the brain, and that you could, in theory, share with someone else, like vision or sensation or even movement. But there are also parts of your soul, your sense of yourself, your spiritual self, your intellect, your will, that are uniquely yours. And it, again, is evidence that the soul is not the same thing as the brain, that we have a spiritual soul.
Wow. That chapter is very interesting, but it now brings us to a section that, Denise, I'd love to talk to you about. Of course, you wrote The Spiritual Brain, but a lot of the argument, I think, that we've developed on this whole idea is that the brain seems to transcend what might be considered death, or at least what some people would refer to as a momentary action that would be considered death. And whether it's Lee Strobel in his book, Is God Real?, Seeing the Supernatural, or even Dinesh D'Souza and all sorts of others, we certainly have quite a bit of evidence of the human mind existing beyond death, don't we?
Well, yes, and here's the really interesting thing. Oh, by the way, Mario Beauregard, a neuroscientist in Montreal, was the first author of The Spiritual Brain. I was the second author.
Sure.
But what's happened in recent years is that there's a great deal of medical knowledge and evidence of the ability of the mind to function when the brain is apparently clinically dead.
Right.
Remember that at one time, concepts of near-death experiences were something that you might hear from mediums and people who attended spiritual seances and things like that, right? Well, what happened with modern medicine is doctors found ways of bringing people back from clinical states of death. And Mike can tell you about an extreme example, but the person would come back and say, I saw a spaghetti stain on your tie. That really happened to Dr. Bruce Grayson. He'd been trying to conceal it from colleagues, but when the patient who had been brought back after a suicide attempt from a state of clinical death was explaining that she had received information that caused her to realize she mustn't attempt suicide anymore, she'd also noticed a spaghetti stain on his tie. That's when he became interested in near-death experiences. He hadn't been previously, or so he says in his book. But that's just an example. But my point is, it's reached the point where you can talk about it in a clinic or an intensive care room, rather than something that people can debate around parlors, if you see what I mean. So one thing that told me that why things are changing is some of the papers I've seen on near-death experiences. A large number of doctors have signed on to them. Some of the articles are published in medical journals.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking people aren't running to every door and window to get away from this because it's just crazy. It's something they're beginning to accept. In fact, when it came out at my church that I was the second author of this book, several people flagged me down and said, well, you know, I don't usually talk about this, but I had a near-death experience. And it did sound like they had had a near-death experience. Yes, I'm surprised. But what I'm mainly surprised by is that it's now something that we can talk about as a normal type of thing that you can discuss in science. Psychology Today, a publication that I would describe as fairly trendy, has published a number of articles sympathetic to the idea that something is going on. Just for example. I know Mike was on a podcast run by a skeptic named Michael Shermer.
Oh, sure.
And Mike tells me that Shermer and the neuroscientist Christoph Koch were quite respectful. They weren't making fun of him. I'm just saying these things are changing now. And the big question for a Christian is probably how to respond to a world where people aren't just denying it. The question is, if they accept it, what will they accept?
And again, I remember, Dr. Egner, when I wrote back in 1980, we had Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, had Raymond Moody, had Kenneth Ring, and that was still kind of on the periphery. But as I think Denise O'Leary has made the case, almost everybody's talking about that now, sometimes in refereed scientific journals. Of course, I just quoted a minute ago Lee Strobel in both his latest books, Is God Real and Seeing the Supernatural. He uses examples which are easily verifiable that they were able to see things that they would not have known if indeed there wasn't a soul that was separate from the body. They wouldn't have seen things, they would not have heard things because these happen outside of their particular environment. And so as a result, that I think is now becoming another powerful argument for the soul, isn't it?
Yes. I think it's becoming scientifically much more recognized as something that is worthy of scientific research and has a lot of evidence supporting it. What characterizes these experiences that materialist explanations can't really account for is that these people have very clear, organized experiences. They have life reviews. They have a conscious decision to return to their body at the end of going down the tunnel. They have perception of things in the room around them while their brain is dead, and they can see things often very, very clearly. In addition, the scientific literature shows that the people that are met by the experiencer on the other end of the tunnel are always dead people. That is, that as far as I know, there's not been a single report of a living person seen on the other side in heaven, even if the experiencer did not know the person was dead.
Yes, I've seen that where they said, why is that person there? Because they've been kept from knowing that person died. Yes.
Right. And these are transformative experiences. People's lives change radically after this.
Yes.
There was a patient named Pam Reynolds who underwent brain surgery in 1991 in a very unusual operation where they had to stop her heart, drain the blood out of her brain in order to fix an aneurysm. They cooled her body down to keep her brain from being destroyed by this, and then rewarmed her, started her heart again, and so on. And during this process, she left her body. She watched the operation from the ceiling of the room. She knew the conversations the doctors had.
Just amazing.
She knew the music that was playing on the radio. And she had a tunnel experience, went into heaven, came back. All of this is very well documented.
Yes. Let me take a break, and when we come back, I thought I'd get into one other issue, and that is, what about this idea of free will? Because that is another, I think, powerful argument, and it's one of the chapters in the book, which, again, I commend to you, The Immortal's Mind, Michael Egner, Denise O'Leary, a neurosurgeon's case for the existence of the soul. We'll continue right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk about The Immortal Mind. Again, you can look for the book in your local bookstore, but we have all the information that you might need to find right on our website, pointofview.net. I thought we'd get into free will, and of course, this issue of free will denialism is quite rampant. And we'll pick on Jerry Coyne for just a minute, evolutionist that argues, well, we're just a biological computer. We have a meat computer in our brains, but everything is deterministic. There is no free will. And it does seem to me that we have Dr. Egner all sorts of very good evidence of free will. Of course, we have the problem that even denying the existence of free will is sort of a self-refuting argument. But help us out, because you've devoted a chapter to that, and that's another very important issue, because if we don't have free will, then my booklet I wrote recently on the criminal justice system is a farce, because then there's no liability, no culpability, and quite frankly, we just kind of live in a world where we say, well, I was just predetermined to do that. We don't hold people accountable in that world, and that just simply doesn't work in terms of our own experience. But what have you found?
Yes, I certainly agree with you. Free will, there are several reasons why free will is obviously real. The first is that everyone believes in free will, meaning everyone lives their life like free will is real. Even people who deny free will act like free will is real. Jerry Coyne, for example, is a biologist who's an atheist who doesn't believe in free will, put up a post about someone denting his fender in a parking lot, and he was quite angry this guy dented his fender. And I pointed out online that if this person didn't have any free will, the person had no more choice about denting his fender than the car had. The other reason is that, as you had mentioned, the denial of free will is self-refuting. That is, if you're saying that you're really just a meat robot and you don't have any voluntary control over what you do, why would anybody pay any attention to you? Why would anybody listen to what you say if you can't freely choose to tell the truth? There's also a great deal of neuroscience that supports the reality of free will. People have studied activity in the brain when people are making choices, and there clearly is room for freely choosing, and not everything comes directly from the brain. And Wilder Penfield, who we spoke about earlier, did very interesting research on free will, where he could not find a free will region of the brain that he could stimulate to make the person do things that the person thought he was doing freely. Right. In other words, the will was an immaterial part of the soul.
Yes. Very good arguments. And just before I run out of time, Denise, I wanted to come back to you, because a lot of people might say, well, this is kind of a little more difficult book to understand, although it's very readable. So I think, first of all, I want to allay that concern that I wouldn't understand it. I think you'd understand it very well. But how could somebody use this? Because having been the co-author of a previous book, Spiritual Brain, now the co-author of this book, it seems to me, as I suggested, this could be used to maybe challenge some of the assumptions that our skeptical, atheistic friends might have, and this might open a door. But what are your thoughts?
Well, I think you're right. One of my concerns is I don't believe that, based on what we know about science today, which includes neuroscience, there's any justification for what's sometimes called the presumption of atheism, or the presumption of materialism. Like, so often neuroscientists will be interviewed and they'll say, one of these days we're going to find out the spot for consciousness in the brain. Or it's all in the prefrontal cortex, or something like that. And of course, there's a lot of talk, and then you hear a little bit later, well, a recent massive neuroscience study didn't come to any conclusion about which of two major theories was the best theory, but what they did discover was that apparently the prefrontal cortex wasn't as big a deal as everybody thought. So I went and looked it up, and sure enough, that's what everybody did think. So I'm thinking, you know what? These people are on the wrong track. I mean, when it gets to that point, you have to wonder whether there's something about the science that they're not facing up to. And my suggestion is they're not facing up to the reality that our minds are immaterial. If they don't believe anything can be immaterial, then I don't know how they manage to do or work with mathematics, because if there was ever a subject that's immaterial, that's it, right?
We'll see.
So, yeah, well, it's true. The same people who would boast to you that they're very good mathematicians also want us to believe that everything is material. And I'm thinking, I think we need to sit down and look at some of these people's presuppositions and say, but I don't know why that should rule. I don't know why you are looking for the consciousness thought in the brain. You can if you want, but I have a feeling that 20 years from now, we'll be exactly where we were 50 years ago. Because I think you're looking for the wrong thing.
Very good. Dr. Egner, again, I might come to you as well, because the reason you wrote this book is because you have dug into the science, and you argued before that you thought science could explain everything, but we recognize, whether we look at the history of the scientific method or the great leaders of scientists who were oftentimes theists themselves, you see, I believe, no contradiction between your biblical convictions and your scientific enterprise. If nothing else, I think those are coming together in very remarkable ways, aren't they?
Absolutely. There is no contradiction between good science and faith, because good science speaks the truth, and faith is the truth. I, in fact, use my inference to design in the world in my own research. In my university, I'm studying blood flow to the brain. And I have used the inference that the way the blood flows to the brain is a design system. And the design of it actually has yielded a great many insights into how blood flow works in the brain that one wouldn't have if you didn't assume that it was a design system.
Yes.
So the inference to design, the inference to the reality of the soul makes science much, much better.
Well, again, intelligent design, something we talk about so often here on Point of View, and of course something they talk about at the Discovery Institute. Just before I run out of time, let me just mention again that the book, if you would like to know about it, is entitled The Immortal Mind. It's just now coming out, so you're hearing about it even maybe before some of them have landed in the bookstore. If you look at the various endorsements coming from all sorts of people that we've had on this program, like Sean McDowell and George Gilder, as well as Nancy Piercy and a variety of other individuals, Bill Dembski. So again, I think you will find the book very helpful. I think it is one that really could begin to challenge some of the non-Christian and atheistic and materialistic assumptions of some of your friends, neighbors, coworkers, even family members. And so we have that information on our website at pointofview.net. Let me also point you to a video. It is entitled The Scientific Evidence of the Human Soul. It was the message that was given by Dr. Egner at the 2025 Dallas Conference on Science and Faith. I think you'll enjoy watching that, and it might be something you might want to pass on to others as well. So again, these are resources that we wanted to put in your hands. If you'd like to find out a little bit more about that, simply go to our website, pointofview.net. We've got all the information that you need right there as well. Also want to thank the individuals that have made this broadcast possible. Engineering, certainly want to thank Megan for her help engineering the program, and Karen, thank you for producing the program, and we'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places, and some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.